Hi there, welcome to Altitude, NATS's monthly live stream. My name is Cheryl and I'm the head of the Airspace Organising Group, or ACOG as we're better known. I'm delighted to have been invited by NATS to host today's session as we're talking about airspace modernisation. So over the next 40 minutes, we're going to be talking about one of the largest, but probably largely invisible national infrastructure projects that's happening in the UK, how it's going to be helping towards the industry's efforts to reduce their environmental footprint, and what makes it such a crucial yet complex and in many cases contentious programme to deliver. To help bring this topic to life, I'm joined by two industry experts, Lee Bolton from NATS and Andy Sampson from Manchester Airport. Hello to you both.
Hi, Cheryl.
So I'm sure there's going to be lots of questions on this topic. For those of you joining live, please do drop them through to the team and we'll aim to get to them at the end of the session. Right, before we kick off then, Andy, Lee, perhaps you could just say a bit about what you do for your respective organisations and how you're involved in this programme. I'll turn to you first, Lee.
Hi, I'm Lee Bolton. I'm the head of airspace development in NATS. And NATS provides air traffic services across the UK, both at airports and in the en route operational domain.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Andy Sampson. I'm the technical lead for the airspace projects at the three Manchester Airport Group airports. So that's Manchester, Stansted and East Midlands. So I oversee the technical design of all the new departure routes and arrival routes coming in and out of the airport, make sure that they're linking in with Lee's network. So over the past few months, I've been responsible for creating about 150 options at Stansted, over 200 at Manchester. And then working those through the gateways that we've had in the process, communicating with all of our stakeholders, and now working to try and to create systems of those routes to link into the NATS network. So I'm part of a team. There's lots of people on stakeholder and environmental analysis and all sorts of things like that. So so I'm just one part of a good team of people working on this.
Certainly, and I think that'll become evident over the course of the next 40 minutes about just how many organisations and people are involved in this. So I should probably just say, because usually there's a NATS person sitting in this chair and I'm a guest host today. So as I mentioned, I'm from the Airspace Change Organising Group, and we were set up in 2019 at the request of the DfT and the CAA, the Civil Aviation Authority, to coordinate part of what is trying to be delivered through airspace modernisation, particularly at the lower level of airspace around airports. So I'll explain a bit more about that as we go on. But we were set up as an independent arm of NATS, so we operate independently of NATS and the airports that are involved in the programme, and we report into an independent steering committee that is governed by an independent chair. So that's ACOG, but as I say, we'll explain a bit more about how this all fits together as we go on. Okay, so before we dive into some of the detail, I thought it'd be useful just to provide a bit of background to UK airspace, and just to make sure we're all on the same page. And I mentioned just before that, this is a national infrastructure programme, and I think very few people think of it like that, but it's exactly the same way as the roads and railways are national infrastructure, so too is our airspace. The thing is that for most people, it's pretty much invisible, but it facilitates the safe operation of tens of thousands of flights every day, every single day of the year. But I think what most people are surprised to learn is that the same basic structures of airspace that were put in place sort of back in the 1950s are still in place today. And you can imagine if our roads and railways hadn't changed since then, and if we're all travelling around in the sorts of the volume of cars we have today and the sorts of cars we have on little A and B roads, we just wouldn't get very far very quickly. So obviously, since those 1950s, traffic levels have increased significantly. We see around 2.5 million flights a year using UK airspace, and obviously the aircraft that use the airspace are way more sophisticated than they were back in those times. But the airspace structure and the route network around that just hasn't kept up, and it's become inefficient, effectively. So the government luckily recognised this back in 2018, and they developed something called the Airspace Modernisation strategy, which has just recently undergone a refresh earlier this year. So its vision is to deliver quicker, quieter and cleaner journeys and to add more capacity. So within that airspace modernisation airspace modernisation strategy, there's a number of elements that need to be delivered in order to modernise airspace. And there's a whole bunch of organisations that are involved in doing that. But for the purposes of today, we want to focus on what's happening inside controlled airspace. So the commercial flights that we use, and rather than focus on the other aspects of the AMS. So Lee, I just thought it'd be useful. Could you explain to the people listening who might not be understand the difference between controlled and uncontrolled airspace, what we mean by that? And also in terms of the need to modernise controlled airspace, what are some of the challenges faced by NATS at the moment in the way that it currently operates?
Sure, and with an introduction like that, Cheryl, what a time to be involved in airspace modernisation. We've got a lot to do, and we need to crack on and do it. In terms of controlled airspace, in simplest terms, that's the airspace within which an air traffic control service is provided. There are various classifications of airspace, of controlled airspace, and various rules and regulations associated with each classification. But in its simplest terms, within controlled airspace, we provide an air traffic control service. We provide guidance, direction, and instructions to ensure separation between aircraft. Aircraft have to file a flight plan or request a clearance to enter that controlled airspace, comply with air traffic control instructions, and maintain radio contact. That's all within controlled airspace. Outside of controlled airspace, in uncontrolled airspace, those rules and regulations are far fewer. There are rules of the air which pilots have to abide by. But ultimately, there's far more freedom to operate, and ultimately, aeroplanes keep separation through the see and avoid principle. They watch out, they see other aeroplanes, and they take the appropriate action to avoid them. So that's the difference between controlled airspace and uncontrolled airspace. So therefore, you can probably anticipate that you find controlled airspace in the busiest volumes of airspace, which are dealing with airliners, biz jets, and such aircraft as that. So you tend to have controlled airspace around the larger airports that need to protect the operation with close to into the airport, on the runways, etc. And then if there are various airports quite closely linked, and by that I mean perhaps 50 miles apart, but that's close in airspace terms, then we will link those two structures with controlled areas to protect the operations going into and out of those airfields. And that's when we establish controlled areas, terminal manoeuvring areas, particularly the big areas have terminal manoeuvring areas. And then we also protect the routes that the aeroplanes fly during their en route phase of flight. Protect those routes with controlled airspace so that we can provide the appropriate separation. And in UK airspace, it is all controlled airspace above 19,500 feet. So that gives you a flavour of where you might see these controlled airspace structures as opposed to uncontrolled airspace. The challenges, well, there are many, as we're probably aware of in the industry, but ultimately, I think it's correct to say, yes, airspace modernisation absolutely has to happen all across UK airspace, but it doesn't mean to say airspace hasn't changed over many, many years. My first change was in 1996 when I got involved in that all those years ago. But ultimately, since then, we've tended to focus airspace change on specific areas where it needed it, where there might have been a high level of demand, or we needed to generate more capacity, or just improve the performance of the airspace. And it wasn't such a wide and varied program as we're currently embarking on now with lower and upper airspace. So for that reason, en route airspace has evolved. The lower airspace hasn't evolved as quickly. And that's the challenge I think that we have, is how do we make it fit for the future? Because we operate most of the airspace within the UK, and particularly in the terminal manoeuvring areas, we're responsible for providing services within that area. And the foundations of that area were pretty much built decades ago. They have been built on, they've expanded, but the foundations are still there from decades ago. And therefore, decades ago, airspace was designed in a very different way to the way we do it today, or can do it today. But because those changes are in the heart of our operation, it's really quite difficult to change them, as well as manage and run the operation. And that's what we need to do, because really we overperform on a daily basis. Our service performance is really good, and we hope it will continue that way. But we're building it and delivering it on a foundation that is years and decades old. And that's a challenge. It works because of the rate of intervention of our controllers. Controllers have to intervene to separate the aeroplane. They do that incredibly well. They do that safely, and they deliver a great performance and service performance. But it's not easy to do that. It takes a lot of workload per flight, and quite frankly, it's just not sustainable if we continue to grow. And therefore, those are the challenges that we face. How do we make the airspace more efficient? How do we make it less workload intense? How do we develop the capacity to meet the demands of the future? We've all very focused on sustainability, and a big focus of the change in the future must be to deliver that capacity in a sustainable and as efficient way as we possibly can. So those are the sort of challenges that we've got, not least the scale of doing all this in the time frame that we want to achieve it.
Yeah, but we can no, go on.
No, I was going to say, from a NERL point of view, those are our sort of challenges. But I guess, Andy, from an airport's point of view, you've got your challenges as well in terms of operating the airport, et cetera, et cetera. Give us an insight to that, perhaps.
Yeah. I mean, it's a similar sort of thing. I mean, this is, as you said, this is really a once in a lifetime opportunity to do this. This isn't just changing the spark plugs and doing an oil change. This is something, a wholesale change to what we're doing and how we're going to be operating. So, it's hugely important for us as an airport, and for us collectively as an industry. From a MAG point of view, I think I've kind of I can split it into two areas. One's the why do we need to do it, and the second one is why do we want to do it. And I think we need to do it partly because a lot of the infrastructure that a lot of our current routes and the way we operate is based upon isn't going to be there going forward into the future. That's gradually, as part of the Airspace Modernisation strategy that's come out that you mentioned, Cheryl. That's there's a move to take a lot of that out. Secondly, the airlines have invested in new aircraft and more efficient aircraft and uprated aircraft, so they're capable of flying more efficient routes. But the airport procedures haven't really kept pace with that. So, there's a need to bring ourselves up to speed with what they've got. And thirdly, the airport routes are in a lot of cases aren't necessarily noise or fuel efficient. So, there's three things why we need to do what we need to do. So, ultimately, it all sits with the airspace modernisation strategy that's driving us towards doing that. But there's lots of reasons why we want to do it, because, as you say, Lee, this infrastructure is 40, 50 more years old, and from our point of view, what that means is that the passenger experience in a lot of cases isn't great. And we've signed up to undertakings under the climate change agenda and things that we want to do from an organisational point of view. So in terms of the passenger experience, we're investing a lot of money in terminal buildings, security, airside infrastructure, to make the passenger experience a whole lot better than it is today. But of course, once they get on the plane, and if they're then sitting at the holding point of the runway because the airspace is substandard, that's not creating that through that efficient journey for people. So it's a bit like travelling from London to Manchester on the M6, and the last 20 miles are single carriageway because you just can't get the flow through there. So firstly, we want to get rid of some of the delays and give people a better experience of flying. Ultimately, unhappy passengers is unhappy airlines, is an unhappy local communities, and actually unhappy work staff at the airport, because people are having to wait for things to sort themselves out. The other one, of course, is the environmental agenda, and Lee, you touched on that really well. Yes, of course, as an airport, we want to grow, but we are it's absolutely crucial to us to grow in a sustainable way. Airports are part of the local community. We know that we're not always the best neighbours, but in MAG we're committed to being a positive part of that community and driving economic and social benefits into how we operate. So in terms of what airspace can bring, we can the aim is to reduce the impact of noise on local communities, not just where we put the routes, but how we operate them, what times of the day we potentially operate them, and secondly, making a positive contribution to the net zero targets that we've got. So there's the aim to reduce the climate change impact, and we've got targets around 2050. MAG, we've actually got targets in that's ahead of that. So, that it really is a big pledge to that, both that environmental and decarbonisation agenda. So for us, it's, as I say, it's a need and a want balance.
Yeah, and I think that's true, that the only reason really current airspace works okay today is because of the clever people at NATS who are constantly, as you're saying, they constantly intervening with these flights, making sure that they're making as efficient use of the airspace that currently exists as they can. But we know that, the consequence of that is that the airspace is operating at near capacity, and you do see air traffic control delays even today, which will only get worse in the future without making these changes. So yeah, I mean, there's clearly lots of good reasons to modernise airspace, and it is long overdue. I know you say, Lee, there have been some changes made in the past, but you say it's been a bit sort of tinkering at the edges in many cases, rather than this wholesale change that needs to be done, which I think that the program that's sort of set out within the airspace modernisation strategy is something that's never been done at this scale in the UK before. So it is extremely complex program to do, particularly because UK airspace is some of the busiest in the world. I don't know if it's the busiest around London, but it's certainly some of the the busiest. And as you were saying, Andy, all this has got to be done while the planes are still flying. It's not like when you build a new road and you can just build it offline and then link the two overnight and join up, and you wake up in the morning and you've got a new road to drive on. It's all got to happen whilst the world continues. So I think it's difficult for people to get their head around how this happens, across the whole of the country. In terms of ACOG and our role, so as I said, we were set up to help coordinate the changes around the airports that are making these lower level changes, and we have been tasked with creating something called the Airspace Change Master Plan. So that provides, in time, will provide all the details of the airspace change proposals that the airports are undertaking, that are currently under development, and those are the airspace change proposals that will make a significant contribution to the government's pledge to, for quicker, quieter and cleaner flights. But I think, obviously ACOG, we're not there to actually draw up the designs or create the flight paths and the routes, and that's the responsibility of each of the airports involved in this. So there's 22 airports involved in the programme. We've split those into clusters based on geographical locations, and we'll start with Scotland, then we'll move down to the Manchester area. There's some airports in the west, Bristol, Cardiff, and then there's the London area, which is the big, golden goose, I suppose, because that's where the most of the problems are, but also where most of the benefits are going to be delivered. But Andy, could you just explain how, so you're representing Manchester Airport, for example, and you're working with other airports. How does it work? How do you get together and come up with a design that works for everyone?
Yeah, it's quite. This is one of the most complicated parts of the process that we've come across so far. I mean, but it's an area where we've actually seen a lot of progress in the last 18 months. So certainly when we started developing the new routes, both arrivals and departures, just because of the way the process works, we tended to do that somewhat in isolation. We talk to each other in general terms, but not in the detail that we are now. But certainly over the last year or so, we've seen a huge ramp up in the engagement between both airport to airport, airport to NATS, and then multiple airports with NATS in what we're doing. So in a lot of cases, we're now entering kind of like a detailed design phase where we're looking at how the routes are going to operate and connect to the network. So it absolutely has to work as a system. Just considering yourself in isolation is never going to work. So that's really what we're looking at now. We start to look at, from a capacity point of view, what is the best system of routes for us. But then, okay, well, taking a little bit further down the route, is that going to interact with some of our arrival routes that we've got coming in? And then as you go further out, is that going to start interacting with other airports? And Lee, as you said, 50 miles in airspace terms isn't particularly far. So for us in Liverpool, it's pretty close. So we obviously both want the best solution for both parties. Number one priority is safety. So how can we create a set of routes that can operate together in a safe manner? That's the number one consideration. And then we start to look at where the routes potentially interact, but not necessarily in an unsafe manner. So we start to look at whether we can then move the routes perhaps laterally, from side to side a little bit, vertically, perhaps substituting an option, so switching one out for another one, and creating a network like that. So we look at multiple different options between us. So that process is only really just starting in Manchester over the last couple of months or so. So it's really sort of it's very much work in progress at the moment, but it's continuing as we're going through the process, and it will ultimately accumulate in a sort of a network and system designed for the Manchester terminal area that NATS can then go off, and Lee and his team can go off and then simulate to see if it works. So that's the basic process. It's sitting around and just trying different combinations of routes to see what works best.
Okay, and clearly whatever you come up with has an impact on the ground, particularly as around airports we're talking about the lower levels, so below 7,000 feet.
Yeah.
And I think, we know for a fact that there are communities who are concerned about this, because there are people who have flight paths over their homes who kind of have got used to that potentially, but there's always a concern if flight paths are going to change. So how do you involve? How do the stakeholders get involved in this? What kind of influence do they have on it?
Yeah, so the whole process that's set up is one where there is a good deal of collaboration and involvement of the general public in it. So if you cast your mind back probably 7 or 8 years in the old process, you get a whole load of experts in a room. We'd come out with the best solution, and that was it, and it'd be presented as pretty much a fait accompli. That's no longer the case. Now we have to establish right at the start a set of design principles. So what are the things that are important to people in what we design? And those design principles run all the way through the project. And those aren't just things that we as an airport come up with. Those are agreed with our stakeholders and our local communities. And that whole process about stakeholder involvement and engagement continues all the way through as we're starting to develop our designs, what we've done. So certainly both at Manchester, Stansted and East Midlands, we've had two phases of design. So we've just looked at broad areas where we might take routes, and then we filled those in with some lines on a map to show people kind of what is likely to happen, or where routes could potentially go. And then as we move forward over the period of time, we start to develop these systems. Then we're going to move into the period of full public consultation. But throughout this, it's not just a sort of touch point at certain points because the process tells us to do. All airports will have their own stakeholder reference groups, so we'll be engaging with parish council, unitary authorities, local authorities, MPs. So there's a huge amount of trying to keep people involved and informed. Ultimately, we don't want to make these choices alone. We want to bring the communities with us, because even we're not all going to agree on everything with airspace. It's one, as you say, Cheryl, it's one of those subjects that is always going to create a reaction in people. But what we want to do is help people to understand why we've created what we've created. There's always going to be a balance of impacts and benefits. Everybody has their own view, but it's really about trying to get people to an understanding of why we're trying to do what we're doing. The more quality arguments that we can have about that, and the more information we can have to help us make that decision, that's great. But we want to bring the communities with us, not just do it in isolation.
Yeah, and I think some of the work that we've been doing with you, ACOG, with the airports, is around, because clearly, as you say, there are airports in close proximity. So there'll be some communities that may potentially be impacted by by 2 airports. So it's looking at what the cumulative impacts are of that change are going to be.
Very
and
much so, and that's going to be a
yeah.
really valuable piece of work about how we go through that. And it comes back to what I was saying about, moving left and moving right, up and down, and having a structure to do that is going to be really helpful in how we're able to explain to communities why we've got the decisions that we've got.
Exactly. I think that transparency is really important, that people can see why the decisions were made. If airports are making trade-offs between 2 routes, then it needs to be explained how that decision was made. So that's the airports, and as I mentioned, the airports are responsible for the design of routes below 7,000 feet. So Lee, can you explain what NATS are doing above that? How do you plug into what the airports are doing? Presumably it's not just the airports share theirs, you share theirs, and you just hope they meet in the middle.
No, it's a little bit more sophisticated than that. But collaboration, working together is absolutely key for here, because it is a network, and the network is useless if the entry and exit points of a network don't connect. So where airports are looking at, obviously, the analogy to the roads, the entry and the exit lanes, we're looking at the trunk roads, the main, the motorways of the sky, really. And it's all, from our point of view, absolutely airspace modernisation, but it's about benefit delivery, and there are lots and lots of different types of benefit that can be delivered. You can have a better noise profile, reduce CO2 emissions, reduce fuel burn, quicker, cleaner, quieter journeys, and generate benefit. The demand, we're not in control of the demand. We are required to provide a service to meet reasonable growth in demand, and therefore our focus is on trying to come up with the best possible solution to all those and deliver all those types of benefit. Coming back to sustainable aviation, net zero, yes, it's not all about CO2 emissions. There are other benefits as well, but just to put it into context, by 2050, the airspace above 7,000 feet is required to deliver 1.1 million tons of CO2 less per year. Now, that's an awful big figure, and you will only do that from having a very efficient airspace design. So my team are working really hard across all areas, Scotland, Manchester, London, the en route phases of flight, coming up with options and using data as the basis for assessing those options. What is a track distance length of today of a route compared to tomorrow? Trying to introduce continuous climbs and descents. Today, I talked about the rates of intervention are really high in the busy terminal manoeuvring areas because they have to intervene to make the system work. That intervening very often means that aeroplanes level off. That's inefficient. More engine wear, more fuel burn. If we can create routes that are separated by design using the capabilities on board the aircraft, performance-based navigation, required navigational performance, which is really the high end of navigational capability, it means that we can design routes that are separated, don't converge and then diverge, but they're separated all the way through. We can give continuous climbs and descents as far as we can, and it becomes a far more efficient operation. So the team are working on the Scottish TMA, as I said, all the TMAs of terminal manoeuvring areas at the moment, coming up with those options. We've also got the strategy of free route airspace above 24,000 feet. Hopefully we can bring that down to 20,000 feet over time, but below that, a systemized operation. And what we mean by systemize is literally trying to reduce the amount of intervention that's required. It's more predictable. In the lower airspace, aeroplanes can file an efficient route and fly an efficient route, knowing that it's providing separation against other routes in the sky. And that's our main aim. We're going through lots and lots. We're using digital tools to achieve this. And a good example of that was the West change that we brought in. It was the first deployment of the Airspace Modernisation strategy, the FASI implementation program. Which occurred this March, and that was the largest ever change that we've introduced over 3 years in development, a really large scale change, which absolutely married the converting the previous airspace design overnight into a systemized airspace below 24,000 feet and free route airspace above. We have deployed in 3 separate areas now free route airspace, and that's working well. But West overall just gives a scale of the change that we've got coming up. Over 800 of our staff required briefing or training over many, many months. It was the largest airspace change and change to the UK Aeronautical Information publication, which details all the change, all of UK airspace. Over 1,000 pages of that document had to change because of the West changes. We reduced controlled airspace to bring benefit to the general aviation community, equivalent to 2 times the size of the Gatwick control zone. So it just goes to show, and since implementation, the data that we're seeing suggests that the systemization and the operation, where there are 19% fewer clearances being given. Now, that's a significant difference, and that's comparable between this June and last June, quite comparable in terms of traffic volumes. So it just goes to show why we are excited about the benefits that this can bring, why we do really need to persevere, commit, and deliver airspace modernisation, because what we're seeing is a far more modernised airspace in the West. We're seeing benefit delivery at the moment, and we believe that we can deliver that type of capability and modernisation into the challenging areas of our terminal manoeuvring areas. But the only way we'll ever do that is working closely with our airport colleagues, because ultimately we generally operate the airspace within which supports the airports. Even though the airports are responsible for progressing airspace change, we operate it. So we have to be able to work with those airports to ensure that it's safe, effective and efficient. So it gives you a sort of scale of the amount of work that's going on at the moment.
Yeah, that sounds great, West. And what about other areas, free route airspace? Are you planning to do the same in other areas of the UK?
Absolutely. As I say, we've done most of Scotland upper information region. There's still a little bit in the south that we need to do. We've done the west. We've done a very small piece in the southwest corner of our airspace, but the majority of the airspace remains over England, over the northern part of the Manchester region, over the Midlands and the southeast is still to be delivered. But we're working up plans to do that. It needs to be choreographed really closely with our technical transformation program, which is always also ongoing. And it also needs to be cognizant of the airspace designs that are happening in the lower airspace, in the terminal manoeuvring areas. So the whole team are working on this. We're not exactly clear exactly when we want to or when we can deliver it at the moment, but it's certainly plans are, through this decade, a pretty continual delivery of airspace change. We need to give our controllers a gap to be able to be familiar with the changes that are coming in, but there's a lot of change coming up and we're working through those plans in which to do it. But yes, there is a plan to roll out free route airspace across the whole of UK airspace.
And I think it's those sort of those benefits that you just outlined earlier, with 20% less transmissions. That if that can be translated into some of the terminal operations, that really is a ringing endorsement of what we're trying to do, and it will be a massive help in terms of workload and efficiency and trying to get aircraft just operating a lot more efficiently than they are today.
Yeah, I hadn't fully understood that the amount of radio traffic that goes on between aircraft and air traffic controllers is a constraint in itself, isn't it? Because air traffic controllers can then only deal with a certain number of planes in the sky. So if you can systemize and they're just on their way without that intervention required, then it makes the whole thing a lot smoother.
I don't think we'll ever totally crack the nut and everything will run on rails. But if we can chip away and improve on those that can, it gives more space, more thinking time for our controllers to intervene and improve on the structure that we've generated for them to operate within. And that's the key thing, trying to reduce the amount of workload. We don't like to generate delay, obviously, but safety is our absolute priority. And with the old current airspace, and the demands placed upon it, that's an awful lot of workload, an awful lot of radio calls and clearances given. And therefore, we have got to monitor the safe capacity of the system. So therefore, we want to improve the capacity of the system through implementing these new systemized separated routes. Hopefully that will deliver the benefits and give us a good foundation to introduce all the other new airspace users, because it will be a more predictable operation. Therefore, we can plan it better. We can work ways in which to integrate these new airspace users, etc.
Okay, great. I've just spotted the time, so we probably need to have a look at some of the questions that are coming in. And actually, one of them, the first one I can see on my screen, is around what we can expect from a modernised airspace. And I think you've kind of neatly explained that it's around systemization. Compare with the current airspace structures and what's going on today. There's far less intervention from controllers. Everything just is more efficient. And the way you were describing, particularly if you think around the London airports, it's sort of a bit of a bowl of spaghetti, isn't it? And it all needs just straightening out and simplifying, so everyone can fly more direct routes, burning less fuel, which will be good for the environment, as well as fuel burn and capacity reasons.
Yeah, and I think one of the key benefits will be this performance, the application of performance-based navigation. It really will enable us to pull the routes closer together, put more routes into the available airspace and safely. But nonetheless, that in itself is the exploitation of that capability is what will unlock airspace that is, unfortunately at the moment, because of the way it was designed all those years ago, for good reason, but it will unlock pieces of airspace which at the moment just aren't available.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I mean, obviously from an airport point of view, systemization is important to us, and if we can get benefits in a TMA that's less delay, less fuel burn, fewer people impacted by noise, we can work routes in a different way. I think the other big difference once we get into future airspace is that we can better use the performance characteristics of the aircraft. So firstly, on in terms of their performance-based navigation, so we can get the aircraft to fly more accurate routes. But secondly, how they climb, how they descend, so we can get aircraft to cruise quicker. That'll give fuel and noise benefits, but also what it'll do, and it goes back to your point right at the start, Lee, about controlled airspace. If we can get aircraft up higher, it means that we've got the opportunity to release controlled airspace at lower levels. So actually, it's another thing that comes into the airspace modernisation strategy, which is about freeing up airspace for all and for a greater number of users. So if we don't need it for commercial flights, let's reallocate it for other use if it's safe to do so. So, and ultimately, all of this needs to go through the process with the CAA, and the CAA need to approve everything that we do. But ultimately, there's lots of different opportunities that it will create, not just the obvious ones about it's making things go in a different way.
Yeah. Okay. Great. We've had a question in, Lee. It's probably for you. How do you work with other air traffic control providers across Europe to make sure that what we're doing in the UK is complementary to what's happening elsewhere?
I think the simple answer to that is closely. Any interface is a potential risk, because you need to know what the other organisation intends to do or is doing. So we work with our adjacent partners in terms of all the partners around UK airspace when we need to discuss future developments. We work with the airports. We work with wherever there is an interface between our operation and someone else or some other organisation. We work with them whenever we want to change it. As you can imagine, we're very focused on airspace modernisation in the UK, but that's no different to elsewhere. So again, the synchronisation of these changes is always a key consideration, and we have to agree the procedures, simulate the procedures where necessary, but also agree those procedures and get them signed off by adjacent organisations. We have letters of agreement, etc., with them. So we work very closely, but it's a long-term plan, and therefore we have to engage early to understand if others can support that.
Okay, thanks. Got a good question here. What would you consider as the greatest risk or risks to the modernisation process? I'm sure there's plenty. Andy,
Well,
do you
yeah.
want to start?
Yeah, I think it's the complexity of it all. One of the things you hear most often in any meeting to do with airspace is that, well, if it was easy, we'd have done it years ago, and that's really really true. And in the London area in particular, because of it's so congested and so complex. But it's in different ways. It's no less complex in Scotland and around the Manchester area. So. Because this is something that we've never done before in anybody's lifetime to this scale, the complexity is probably the biggest risk, and the knock onto that is not just the time it takes to do it, but delivering what we really want to deliver. So we could put something together and make it safe pretty quickly, but it wouldn't deliver on the delays or on the fuel benefits or on the noise or whatever it happens to be. So it's having that complexity is driving things to take longer than we would probably want to. We want to crack on and do it and get it in, and that's it. Right, let's get it completed and get the benefits from it. But it's complicated and it takes time, and that's it makes for an exciting project, and it makes your brain hurt. But yeah, sometimes it can get massively frustrating.
Yeah,
I'm sure it's the same for you, Lee.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I was just saying, I think the biggest risk to it is not doing it. We cannot stand still, particularly in the lower airspace. We need change, we need modernisation, and if we, for whatever reason, don't do it, that is the biggest risk to the whole of the biggest risk of delivering benefit. We must focus on it. We've got to commit to it. Yes, there is a scale of change, and the process is long. The process is complicated, but if you take it in chunks, it's sort of understandable as well. We need to identify and articulate why we need the change, then sort of understand the design principles we want to apply, develop options, get some assurance around it. They're all very logical steps, but the scale of the challenge makes it, even more challenging a process. But like any risk, you can mitigate it. So as long as the plan is a credible plan and we're bought into it, and we continue to buy into it, then from my point of view, the risks are manageable, but we must modernise UK airspace.
Yeah, absolutely.
I agree. I mean, I think we've got a process that's logical. I think from an airport's perspective, it's having the degree of pragmatism and the ability to work within that process to make things happen. So that's what we really want, is to have a strong process that is legally correct and sustainable, and does all those right things, but with sufficient flexibility to allow us, and pragmatism to allow us to do what we need to do. And it's not just from an airport; it's from a Leeds perspective as well.
No, and I think that complexity is recognised, and that was probably one of the main reasons ACOG was set up in the first place. Was previously it had been left for airports just to make their own airspace changes, and clearly you're all commercial entities with your own competing interests, and all want your bits of the airspace to achieve what you want it to achieve. And I suppose the point of ACOG was to come in and provide that independent, impartial voice, that to come up with a system-wide design that works for everyone as far as possible. But where these trade-offs need to be made, then to sort of get involved and sort of help coordinate that. So I think this time around, it's the first time, as I say, there's this program involving all these airports, and it's got a body that's helping to coordinate that, working closely with NATS and all the other stakeholders. So I think that's kind of being tackled. And the other important thing to this is that we maintain government support for it, which we do have, and it's definitely a key priority for government. We've seen that we got some funding during COVID to keep it going. All the airports were at risk of just stopping their program, so there was £9 million given to the airports for to continue through some of the stages of the CAA process. So that's been great, and we just need to make sure that continues into the future as well.
I think just picking on the point you made there. I mean, airports are all commercial entities, and we're all competing with each other. I think one of the things that's been fascinating through this is the degree of cooperation, collaboration. Everybody's aiming for the same output. We're not sitting there fighting about this. We all realise the importance of this and the need to do it, and the need to be realistic and pragmatic about it. And it's it's been good to see that, and the same has been with working with the airlines. They've had a lot of input, certainly in the early stages of our designs, and we continue to talk to them on a regular basis about what we want to do, how we want to do it, putting scenarios to them about, well, what if we did this? Could you climb at this rate? Could you turn here? Da, da, da. So lots of different things that we can involve that we can and do involve the airlines with.
Thank you. Well, I know we like talking about airspace change, but we have run out of time, unfortunately. I know we could talk about it for hours. I'm sorry we haven't got to answer all your questions, but my thanks to you, Andy, and to you, Lee, for joining us today. I hope it's helped sort of bring to life what's going on in terms of this very complex program, but absolutely critical national infrastructure program that's happening, and how it will deliver a number of benefits, not just in terms of enabling additional capacity in the future, but also, delivering on the Jet Zero, the government ambitions to reduce the aviation industry's impact on the environment. So you can see that collaboration is absolutely key to this, and we'll all keep drumming away on this. So and hoping to deliver in the next sort of 5 to 10 years. We'll all see some changes and won't experience the delays when we go on holiday. So if you're interested in finding out more about airspace modernisation, you can find that on the NATS website, or please visit ACOG's One Sky, One Plan website. And this, the on-demand version of today's episode will be available shortly after we finish, and an audio-only episode will be available to listen to wherever you get your podcasts. So please keep an eye on NATS's social media channels for updates on future episodes of this. Thank you so much for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed it, and see you soon. Goodbye.